drew up the first plans for SCLC because Martin asked me to. I helped plot the strategy for the Montgomery protest because he asked me to. I put on the March on Washington for all the civil rights leaders because they asked me to.
Still hear people say that I should not be talking about the rights of lesbian and gay people, and I should stick to the issue of racial justice. But I hasten to remind them that Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere."
America's not like a blanket, one piece of unbroken cloth, the same color, the same texture, the same size. America's more like a quilt, many patches, many pieces, many colors, many sizes, all woven and held together by a common thread. The white, the Hispanic, the black, the Arab, the Jew, the woman, the Native American, the small farmer, the business person, the environmentalist, the peace activist, the young, the old, the lesbian, the gay, and the disabled make up the American quilt.
Good evening, everyone. We are so glad that you are here with us for this conversation. Just as a small aside, we were already going to play that video as a part of our introduction, but it feels extremely timely today, as we welcome Reverend Jesse Jackson into the realm of ancestors. So just wanted to, name that and how it feels like we are having the right conversation at the right time. So I am here to bring greetings and say welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this timely discussion, which we have entitled, "Was the Civil Rights Movement Gayer Than We Remember?" A conversation on trans and LGBTQ plus advocacy, respectability, and civil rights memory. At Pride in the Pews, we see the lived experiences of Black LGBTQ plus communities as sacred text. We believe they have something to teach us and that we should return to them again and again to discover new gems and pearls of wisdom they continue to offer. And so this is going to be an interactive conversation. We're going to launch our first poll right now. We just want to see how many people who are with us this evening had seen any of those clips before. So we had the clip from Bayard Rustin, we had the clip from Coretta Scott King, and we had the clip from Jesse Jackson. And so just want to get a feel for the room. Which one of those, if any, had you seen before? Okay. Also, but I love real-time statistics. It's like half and half, but not quite, almost. Awesome. So we got about 9 people who had seen none. So completely new introduction to this type of advocacy. And then the other numbers are a little all over the place. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And thank you. I'm glad we were able to introduce you to something new. So when we think about the conversation we're going to have today, activism has traditionally not been made visible. Our stories are not static. They deepen with time. They reveal more when we're willing to listen closely. We see Black History Month here at Pride in the Pews as an invitation to do exactly that, to return to the stories we think we already know, to sit with them, and to ask what has been remembered, what has been softened, and what has been left out. Tonight, we're doing the work together by revisiting the civil rights movement, a moment we often imagine as fixed and settled, and asking a different set of questions about whose leadership was visible, whose was erased, and how LGBTQ plus people shaped the movement from within. So I also want to say people are actively erasing our stories. Pride in the Pews exists to protect those stories, to name them and to celebrate them, not just in moments like this, but organizationally through research, through storytelling, through training and community care. If you're here, you might be familiar with our work. You might have just seen this on Instagram, but we want to let you know a little bit more about who we are. This work only happens because people choose to invest in it. So if at any point tonight you feel moved, you'll see a link on the screen in just a few moments that will show you how you can give. And if you're interested in that at any time during our conversation tonight, we want to invite you to do so. You can give on Cash App, you can give on Zelle, and you can give on our website. So those are the three easiest ways to give to Pride in the Pews. And if you make a donation, we just ask that you would leave your email address in the memo so that we can get in contact with you and say thank you for your gift. And so if you give on Zelle or Cash App, just leave your email in the memo. But if you give on the website, it'll collect a little bit more information so that we can reach out and say thank you for your contributions. As we move forward in our conversation today, oh, okay, yep, here we go. And the QR code, if you're on your phone or computer, is tappable, clickable. But our Cash App is Pride in the Pews NFP. Our Zelle is finance@prideinthepews.com. And if you give online, you can click that link there. And it's also available directly on our website. And so if you hear something tonight that is inspiring, that you think is memorable, or if you would like to continue to see us be able to do more things like this, we want to encourage you to make a donation. As we move forward, we want to ground ourselves in the lineage that makes this work possible. We do that through libations. And so to help us do that, I want to invite Autumn to lead us in honoring those who came before us and whose stories are too far often erased.
Hey y'all. I have a libation that I'm going to share. I don't know what just happened to the light, but we'll say the spirit is stirring. So I'm going to invite you into this moment. If you are unfamiliar with libations as a spiritual practice or ritual, I would just recommend you Google Delroy Lindo from Sinners and see his most recent clip about it, because I feel like it encapsulates all things. But I'll start now. Let the room come to attention. If you are able, remove your shoes. Feel the ground beneath you. Face east where light breaks open the horizon. I hold cool water in my right hand, clear, uncomplicated, alive. This is water before doctrine, before debate, before division. Covalently bonded chemical compound and ancient philosophical classified element, abundant and cyclical perfection. As I pour on tonight, I, Autumn Nicole Clay, aka Rich Auntie, the daughter of Jack and Adrian Clay, granddaughter of Lee Ethel and Jack Clay Sr., and Barbara Matilda and Robert Sonny Eggleston, an oft-labeled prodigal but ever yet proud daughter of the Black Church. I pour this libation to honor my and our ancestors, named and unnamed, remembered and unremembered. I call the praying mothers whose knees made altars out of hardwood floors. I call the fathers and grandfathers who carried whole worlds in silence. I call the elders who survived policies, pulpits, and punishments designed to break them. I call the ones who crossed waters and still found a song in their mouths. I call the teachers, the organizers, the kitchen table theologians, the abolitionists, and of course, the hoodoos and healers who knew roots in scripture were not enemies, but indeed a winning pair. Come close, stand at the threshold of this gathering, and stay a while. As we honor those, we also pour out for our Q+ ancestors and loved ones, for the choir directors who conducted glory while hiding grief, for the mothers, ushers, musicians, preachers, armor bearers, and theologians in the shadows, for the saints who loved God out loud, yet loved themselves in whispers, for the ones who were told they were contradictions, but remained consecrated, for our house parents and ballroom babies whose love is contagious and joy is made full, for our trans and non-binary heroes whose very existence is the highest mark of divinity. Our prayers never evaporated, our tears were never wasted, our praise is not in vain. You are not an asterisk in our story, but are the foundation. And lastly, we pour for the late Honorable Right Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson, for the preacher who braided pulpit and protest into one continuous sermon, for the son of the Black church who stretched its walls toward the streets, for the architect of rainbow coalitions who insisted that margins were the center of moral power, for the voice that called this nation to account and called our people to the ballot, to dignity, to possibility, to keeping hope alive. You taught us that faith without public courage is hollow. You showed us that prayer can march. You reminded us that hope is not fragile, it organizes. Rest now amongst the great cloud of witnesses. Your labor still speaks. And to our ancestors, we refuse erasure. We speak your presence into this space with reverence and fire. May this cool water touch every place that has been scorched by harm. May it cleanse what was distorted in the name of righteousness. May it restore what shame tried to steal. Guard the doors of this gathering, charge the air with clarity, and let truth eradicate every fear. We are here to remember rightly. We are here to build forward. So receive this offering and drink what is yours. Ashe.
Ashe. Thank you so much, Tierney, for your opening, and thank you, Autumn, for grounding us. Good evening to all of my fellow comrades and co-conspirators who have joined us today. My name is Don Abram, and I'm the founder and CEO of Pride in the Pews. I am so genuinely grateful that you decided to take time out of your evening to join us, and I'm even more delighted that we have some incredible luminaries and interlocutors who will help us explicate tonight's panel entitled, Was the Civil Rights Movement Gayer Than We Remember? Trans and LGBTQ plus Advocacy, Respectability, and Civil Rights Memory. As we move into this conversation, I want to name a couple of central questions that we will grapple with tonight. How did respectability politics shape what we remembered about the civil rights movement? And what was erased? Whose leadership was made legible? And whose was edited out of the story we've inherited? I want us to linger there for a moment because if the story is incomplete or even wrong, it shapes how we organize, it shapes how we build institutions, and how we imagine solidarity today. And so with that in mind, I want to invite our panelists to the virtual stage. I am so grateful for their yes and for their willingness to join us today. I'd love to invite Harrison Guy, Araya Baker, as well as Ciara Jones to the virtual stage to begin this conversation. And we're going to spotlight them so that you might be able to see their lovely faces and bright spirits as we prepare for this conversation. Thank you all so much for being here. And instead of formal introductions, I want you to introduce yourselves through a question that I'll pose, because how you see history is shaped by who you are and how you move through the world. So let's start here. When you look at the civil rights movement as it has been remembered and retold, what do you notice has been cleaned up, softened, erased, or made more respectable? When you look at the civil rights movement as it has been remembered and retold, what do you notice has been cleaned up, softened, erased, or made more respectable? Ciara, I'd love to invite you in and start with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Don. Thank you, Tierney, for your amazing opening. Thank you, Autumn. Thank you, Don, for having me. And it's so great to be here with you, Araya and Harrison, and to be in conversation with you both. And I love this question. And in preparation for this panel, I've actually been rereading Our Lives Matter, A Queer Womanist Theology by Reverend Dr. Pamela Lightsey. And I see that book and God is a Black Woman as my Bibles. One is my womanist Bible, the other is my queer womanist Bible. And something she says all the time, and something she says actually at almost the first page of that text is, there will be those who discount the genius within this text simply because a Black queer woman wrote it. There will be those that discount the idea that there's any spiritual ingenuity in this text or anything to learn about God in this text simply because a Black queer woman wrote it. And so when I think about the civil rights movement, I think about how we erased queer people, not because queer people were not bringing spiritual ingenuity to the table, which I know we'll talk about, but because we've decided that only certain bodies are worthy of celebrating that type of ingenuity from. And so I think today is really about expanding understanding whose body we see as sacred, whose story we see as worthy. And we have to ask ourselves, why do we edit our own history to remove queer narratives from it versus seeing queer narratives as additive to the tapestry of Black liberation? And I think I'm really excited for us to dig into that together. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ciara. Harrison, I'll invite you in, then Araya after that.
Oh, sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be with you all coming from Houston, Texas. And I think what I think about most around that question about what has been erased or kind of cleaned up, I'm really thinking about the tensions that we hold even when we are working towards, a wall, right? We're climbing a mountain, and it is always cleaned up to assume that we're always climbing it at the same pace. We're always climbing it together, that there's never an argument, that there's never a disagreement. And so I think that really hurts us when we think about how messy community work is and how messy movement work is. So we come into these rooms expecting to get along all the time, expecting that it feels good because we know that freedom, that we're looking at might feel good once we get there. And so I think that sometimes looking at that light makes us feel like unresolved when we have tension, and it removes the humanity of how complex it is to be working together just as simple human beings. And so I think we always want to present this as a choir who's always singing in harmony, when we know that that's just not the case when we're doing movement work, when you are wrestling with just humans coming in to work together. So that's something I always think about. Because I do movement work, it always makes me feel bad knowing that people feel bad because there's a disagreement or there's tension. And I'm like, this is the work, it excites me to know that we are honest enough to disagree. And so that's what I'm thinking about as you pose that question.
And Araya, please.
Hey, I'm Raya. I'm joining from Houston, Texas as well. And when I think about that question, my mind automatically jumps to the fact that queer Black people, trans Black people are heavily documented before the Civil Rights Movement and then are curiously absent decades later. So you think about the Harlem Renaissance, for example, there's almost like an overrepresentation of queer and trans Black folks during the Harlem Renaissance and historical research during that period. And then you fast forward a few decades later, and we're just not there. And it boils down to the fact that people have discomfort seeing us in positions of leadership. People have discomfort following us and following our lead, trusting that we will lead them to greater liberation, greater enlightenment. And I think that it's particularly sad when it comes to the civil rights movement in particular, because that is sort of the entry point for most people to examine racial justice. When you think about talking about race with kids, for example, like you usually start with the civil rights movement. You start with Dr. King. Yet there is no Dr. King without Bayard, because that was his sort of pacifist elder who mentored him into nonviolence. That's like what MLK is known for, is nonviolence. That didn't come from MLK himself. It came from his gay mentor, gay Black mentor. And just in addition to that, like a number of like key pieces of legislation from the civil rights movement were a direct byproduct from the I Have a Dream speech, which Bayard organized, the March on Washington, and yet isn't credited at all. We know every child knows that speech. Every child can tell you who is, they can just hear it. They don't even have to see it. They can tell you who MLK is. They can't tell you anything about Bayard. And so in my work, that shows up because so many queer and trans folks of color, specifically Black people, come to me and they have concerns about how their identity development, which is like stunted a lot and traumatized a lot, is interfering with their self-actualization as leaders. They struggle with visibility. They struggle with being seen. They struggle with the backlash that comes from being seen and being visible because there's no roadmap. There's no possibility model. There's no role model that has been shown to them. Of course, they exist, but we're here to talk about the absence of it. So that's what comes up for me.
Thank you so much for that, Araya. And in so many ways, you answered my next question, and I'll invite you to just kind of expound on this a bit. because you're someone who is a mental health practitioner, but also someone who cares deeply about archives and memory. And so
Mhm.
I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about what happens to communities when their history is fragmented or erased.
Yeah.
Particularly, like, what does that kind of forgetting do to how people understand themselves or even understand their self-worth?
Yeah, I think when history is erased and fragmented, we end up lacking cultural and spiritual templates. And those templates are really important because when you're the first or the only, there's a lot of pressure that comes with that. There's a lot of backlash that comes with that. And so if you don't have any roadmap at all to sort of step into your purpose, you've never seen it before, even if you're not actually the only or the first, just within your context, within your community you still feel that pressure. So it definitely affects identity development. It definitely affects your self-esteem, your self-worth, but then collectively as well. Black people are a collectivistic people. That is how we have survived. We are a communal people. And so cultural memory is something that is important to Blackness. Um, I don't know if y'all have seen like the cultural iceberg, where like on top there's the more like embodied, enacted, visible parts of culture. And then underneath the water, there's like these more psychic things, these more psychological aspects, beliefs, self-concept, humor, um, things like core values, attitudes about the environment. Cultural memory is one of those things that's not so visible, but it is core to Black culture. And part of that cultural memory is how we make sense of ourselves through shared experience. And there's a lot of, documentation out there of the things that we have been through. But I think a lot of queer and trans Black folks, and maybe I'll just speak for myself, I always want a more specific version that feels personal to me. It's great to have examples like MLK, Malcolm X, the cishet Black male who is respectable. But eventually you come to find out who you are and to step into who you are and your authenticity, and you want more resonant role models. You want more um, relatability from the people that you look up to. And so that's when I personally began looking for queer and trans folks, didn't see them. And so there's a lot of research out there that actually shows like seeing your community or envisioning your community as something that is continuous, envisioning your own continuity from the past and the present and the future, that is connected to a positive sense of self and a healthy mental state. And so I guess the question becomes like, where do we go and how do we believe in ourselves when we lack the cultural memory? We think back and we don't see ourselves in the past. And I think that feeds into some of the rhetoric that we're seeing resurge now in this political climate where people are sort of framing queerness as this like new age thing, this like trendy thing that's perpetuated by higher education, et cetera. And it's like, no, we've been here. And so for me, I think I take every opportunity to try to amplify archives. I remember I had this epiphany one day where I was thinking about Audre Lorde, rereading her work, and I stopped and I was like, I've never heard her voice. Like, I've actually never heard her speak. And I've been quoting her on social media, in papers, in therapy sessions for like 7, 8 years. Like, where is the footage? And once I got to some footage of her speaking, it just humanized her in a whole different way that made her relatable. And it was an emotional experience for me. And I think going through archives, Harrison can probably speak to this. You are heavily involved in archiving Houston's queer Black history. But it's not just homework. It's not just this scholarly intellectual endeavor. It is very much an emotional process to see yourself in history and to see how you are learning of queer Black people's impact so late in your life,
Yeah.
so late in your 30s and your 40s, and yet you learned about cishet Black folks when you're like 7 or 8.
Right. Yeah, and I know that was certainly my experience. I didn't see or hear Black queer stories, let alone trans stories, until I was in college. Right? I heard about the movements, I heard about cis het folks, but I didn't hear about the folks who embodied the identities that I lived. And with that in mind, Harrison, as an archivist, as someone who also is sort of cultural worker, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the role and importance of archives, but also the role of living memory. This is like what is the role of living memory? So not just what we might be able to dig into a book or a text or even sound, but like living memory, that sort of cultural work. Talk to me a little bit about the significance and importance of that.
Yeah, I love that that as a framing, living, because I think a lot about uh, my work as living archives, because what I want to do, because erasure has happened with so many Black queer folks, specifically in my work with that community here in Houston, because so much of that has been erased and covered up. I want to breathe new life into it. So I don't want to see it as just, static information that we are only reading to remember, but that we are giving people an opportunity to breathe life into it, to breathe life into it again. I would say so. That is very important to my work, and especially as an artist, I use these figures that I'm learning about as subjects for my work today, because I want to reimagine what it might mean to find a queer person that contributed to the city or to the greater landscape of this country, and to do something with it today. So I have a really good example. My latest project was a project that I did at Project Row Houses here, and it was an art installation that I did. I've been dying to remember people we lost from choirs during the height of the AIDS crisis from the Black church, because I consider myself a very out and proud church queen. That is the culture that raised me, and I want to do right by those men. Like, it is just something I must do, right? And so I had the opportunity to do this installation I called it For Choir Boys, Church Queens, and Sissies Whose Sundays Stop Too Soon. And what I really wanted to do was exactly what you just asked, which is just not just remember these people, but what can we do with their memories today? And so, throughout the installation, we had lots of things, as you can probably imagine, to honor these men. But what was really special is we had this wall of names that people gave us in this bright red room, written in this whimsical font that really, it was a memorial in a way that people said it's beautiful. It is not sad. I don't see it as sad. And I think living archives allow you to not just remember people in death, right? But it allows you to remember how they lived. And what was so sweet about this is that a family sent in a memorial for one of the men that we honored. And it was his brothers and sisters. And what they said was, my brother died, of complications with HIV and AIDS back at a time when we had no context of what that meant, right? But your project is allowing us to remember him and to do this over, is what they said. They said, we did not get this right. We know we did not get this right at that time, but this is allowing us to. So they treated this as a literal opportunity to redo the way that they approached him dying at that time. And I just thought, what better example do we have of living archives to say that we can do something with this, today? And so that memory of that family, I mean, they were at the opening and just cried and just remembered him. And what was so sweet is they said, we have to do this for him because we don't know a better man. We do not know a better man. Like, we have lived many years since his death, and in our family, we don't know a better man. And I just thought, to go from shame when this person died to acknowledging that this is the best man you have in your family, and also taking the opportunity to pull his name from an archive and to breathe life into it again, and to redo what you thought was not the best way to send him off. I just thought it was such an example of what archives can do, because I'm simply pulling these people's names out of an archive, but it really is a great example of a living archive, but also what can happen if we do this as Black people. I think that is the Black way to honor somebody like that. You know what I mean? And so I think once we remove these things that have been put on us that are not of our culture, that are not of our DNA, that is not our organic way, our default way of respond. I think their default way of responding to this at that time was the same thing. It's just shame was too strong for them to do it then. Right. And so I often ask people, what's the Black way to do that? Like, how would Black people do that? And it often really does change our approach. And so I just think that that's a great example of what a living archive can do for us today.
Yeah, oh man, that's incredibly helpful. Harrison, can you tell me the name of that project again? Because the name alone just took me out.
Yes, yes. For short, we call it for choir boys, but it's for choir boys, church queens, and sissies whose Sundays stop too soon.
My God. My God. Thank you so much for that, Harrison. That's real good. CR, I want to turn to you. You have a Master of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School. You are a public theologian. You think a lot about God, theology, and Black folk. And I want you to talk to me a little bit about what it means that we've treated the civil rights movement as a blueprint of liberation, as a sort of North Star, while editing out queer and trans bodies. Like, what kind of theology gets produced when certain people are made invisible in the story?
Oh, such a great question. And I also just want to say, Orion Harrison, oh my gosh, thank you for that education, that journey that you both provided, and just all that you shared. Something I know I mentioned Pamela Lightsey before. I got to quote her again, and I'll quote her until the end of time. But then something she says is we have to be careful not to uplift the oppressed de jure, meaning those who we see as the rightful oppressed members of our community, to the detriment of considering the holistic experience of oppression and marginalization amongst Black folks. And for us, Black men have really become the oppressed de jure, those who we lift up to the particularly cis heterosexual Black men, only specific to the detriment of telling the totality of our other stories. And there's so much that happens there. I love that Araya talked about, what happens when we erase part of our history, our stories of who we are. And something that I see it as is like, what happens when we despiritualize an entire member and community group? What happens when we say all queer people are devoid of God? What happens when we say all queer people cannot connect with God? We do something deeply to people. We do something to queer people themselves as individuals to say that God cannot reside in their bodies. And we've seen in our churches the lengths that Black queer folks will go to break themselves so that God will see them, to break themselves so that our communities will see them. And so we have to ask, what have we done as we despiritualized a whole community of queer folks? But there's something else that we do, which is we actually lose our own axes of liberation as well. We lose our own narratives and understandings of God. If we cut off queer people from being the voice, the feet, the hands of God, that means all of us don't know God and God's totality, because God contains queerness as well. So we are missing a whole facet of who God is when we say there is no queerness in God and there's no God in queerness. And so we're harming individuals, but we're also cutting ourselves off at the knees as a community, because we're losing those who are the hands and feet of our justice. And so I think there's a lot that I want folks to consider there. I run a lot of, deconstruction workshops through my consulting firm and online, and I do it for free, donation-based. I just want people to come and get that knowledge and get that support. And the biggest thing that queer people will say is, by the end of my session, we'll spend 90 minutes talking about deconstruction, talking about queer and feminist perspectives of God, talking about Black perspectives of God. And every time a queer person will say, am I just imagining a God that loves me? Did we just make up this God today? And this God only exists in this Zoom, and this God will not find me outside of this Zoom. This God is just a figment of my imagination. And I think we've done so much to queer people to say, a God that loves you is simply a mirage. There's something that we just have done to people to say that a God that loves you is only a fantasy, and a God that rejects part of you is real. Like, we've done something to people. So I think that's something I just have considered a lot in this work is, what do we do? What have we done when we despiritualize an entire community? And what have we done to ourselves in the name of the idea that only cis heterosexual Black men contain God and contain liberation? We're lying to ourselves. We're lying about our own community to uphold a narrative of white supremacy, of cis heterosexual capitalist patriarchy. It makes us feel better, I think, if men can save us, but it's actually healthier if we are all uplifted and saving one another, if we're lifting as we climb together. I've been thinking a lot about Pauli Murray in this conversation as a civil rights activist and leader. But something I think about outside of even her civil rights is the fact that she was the first African-American Episcopal priest. A Black queer woman was the first Episcopal priest. And so I just think there's so much we need to unpack, even as we think about it in this, though she was not a queer woman to my knowledge, Prithia Hall, who really inspired the creation of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Prithia Hall was a Black woman minister. She was shot doing organizing work throughout the civil rights movement. And she was at a vigil a day after being shot, praying about her dream, praying about what she envisioned God had for the world and for Black communities. And Martin Luther King Jr. overheard her saying this refrain, and he did ask for permission to put that in his March on Washington speech, but her genius is never celebrated in that refrain. Only Martin Luther King Jr. And so when we had this singular narrative of one hero, we propagate this myth that it is an individualistic task to rescue a whole community. It is not. When we have this narrative that we have a singular hero, we stamp out every other story that was in that process of Martin Luther King Jr. being who he was. There were queer stories in that. There were women's stories in that. What do we gain when we tell that story fully? We're reminded that everyone is a part of the tapestry of our liberation. Everyone can be a leader. Everyone can be a change maker. But I think particularly when it comes to theology, I really want us to see what happens when we allow Black queer people to step into the fullness of their spiritual power. Bayard Rustin went to India. He came back and brought back nonviolence as a prism through which to situate resistance. Without his spiritual genius, none of us are here. And so what does it mean actually when we can have queer pastors at the pulpit, because they're liberating us too. I want to know God through the lens of queer people. I want to know God out of the mouths of queer people, because I want to know who they experience and know God to be, because all know God more fully through them. And I think that is what we see when we share these stories, and that is what we lose when we bury them, you know?
We cannot fully know God without queer people. We cannot fully know God without trans folks. We cannot fully know God without non-binary folks. In order to fully understand the fullness and totality of the divine, we have to invite them into the room. And it's only inviting them into the room that we not only gain spiritual knowledge, but we become more human. And so I want to thank you so much for that, Ciara. And for those of you who are tuned in, there are over 50 of you who are online and in conversation with us. Thank you so much again for tuning in. I want to invite you to use our Q&A feature to pose questions. There will be time toward the end of this conversation for us to actually pose those questions to the panelists. So as things come up, as they emerge, I want you to drop it in the chat, and we'll be sure to share it out to our panelists during the Q&A portion. I want to invite our panelists now to think about the language, the phrase of respectability politics, particularly in relation to the civil rights movement. And when you think about the language of respectability politics, what image or moment immediately comes to mind for you? Again, when you think of the phraseology of respectability politics, what moment, what image emerges for you? And why do you think that particular moment survived in public memory? All right. And so to contextualize this question, I often think about Claudette Colvin. Of course, a Black woman who, before Rosa Parks, sat on a bus and was defiant and refused to leave. And her story was overshadowed by that of Rosa Parks. And that is a direct example of respectability politics. A dark-skinned Black woman who had a child and was unmarried. Her story was not told. And yet the story of Rosa Parks, a fair-skinned woman who was married and engaged in a respectable profession, her story was told and remembered. And so I'm wondering, as you all think about the civil rights movement, both historic and contemporary, and in relation to respectability politics, what emerges? Harrison, I'll invite you in, and then Araya and Ciara, I'll invite you in.
Okay, I'm going to take probably an approach that is the artistic lens, just because I think we talk a lot about kind of these images that we've seen over and over again. But because I'm an artist, and because dance is what I do, and choreography is my practice, I often think about this question through the frame of Alvin Ailey. And I do so because Alvin Ailey created Revelations in 1960. This is at the height of this time, right? And Revelations has become like the beacon of Black dance and spirituality, and is often referred to as images of the Black church. what is missing from that story is what it means to do church as a queer Black person. And so I often wonder, would Revelations be as big as it is, and as many people want to see it, and it would have been performed as many times if one of the figures was truly who he was when he created, which was a queer Black man? If there was a feminine approach to the men in that piece versus a masculine approach to the men in that piece, if it really reflected the true vision of what you see at a Black church, what might that have looked like? So it's very interesting to see how respectability even made its way into art, which is a place where we typically think people are free to express themselves, free to do them as them. And so for me, as an artist, I'm going to take that approach, is just to think about how it kind of showed up on stages, which is really interesting, I think. And then the second piece of that I would say is it kind of showed up in my own life. I will never forget when the Sandra Bland situation was happening here in Texas, in Prairie View, which is where I went to college. So it's a story that really hit me hard. Is finally a woman that we're talking about in the context of this movement work, and close to home and closer to home because I went to Prairie View. And so I'll never forget deciding that I wanted to go to a Sandra Bland march at Prairie View on the campus, and the way that I filtered like what I would wear to that march was, I mean, this is in reflection. I didn't think about it at that time, but there is a picture that it ended up in the National Museum in DC of that march. And I am in like fatigues and a Black Lives Matter t-shirt. And as I see that picture, I really think about how much stress I put on myself about not showing up, not wanting to take away from this movement for a lot of reasons, because it's finally about a woman, but also it's about Black folk who might not be, queer. So the way that I edited myself in going there, and so I often pose this question to myself: what is the worst that this movement can ask of me? And that is to show up as someone other than myself. Is kind of where I sit with that. Now, of course, I vowed since then to never edit myself in any case, in any part of this movement. When I show up, I have to show up fully, because that is the best that it can ask of me, is to show up, fully as myself. So really thinking about respectability from both my own personal experience and how I experience it myself, but also thinking about it from an artistic lens is kind of where I put a lot of my thought around respectability in movement work.
That's really good. Araya, feel free to expand on what Harrison has offered, or sort of offer something new.
Yeah, it's funny that Harrison would mention attire, because suits are the first thing that come to mind for me
Ah,
when I hear respectability, and how it didn't save us, Dressing in church clothes did not save us from getting hosed, from getting dogs sicked on us, from getting trampled by horses. Um, And so I'm kind of at a point now, and this is probably controversial to say, I'm sort of maxed out on MLK archives. Like, give me a Fannie Lou Hamer, give me a Black feminist from Mississippi. When she's talking, she's on her front porch in the heat, in some overalls, very down to earth. And she's talking about her lived experience. And I think we have to get to a point as Black people where we start asking ourselves, what about that is so uncomfortable? What about letting someone like Fannie Lou Hamer be the representative for us makes us uncomfortable? Why do we need an MLK who's urban, who's educated, Morehouse educated, PhD, married, pastor, respectable, suited? That has been the template for so long. And I feel like, not to discredit or undermine anyone who presents that way, but after a certain point, it's like we're missing the gender and sexuality and the intersectionality piece
yep,
of Black movement building
yep,
when we continue to default to these cishet Black men.
yep.
There's a quote that I actually was going to read um, by this scholar, Duran Marble. He says people marked as Black are living under and in an anti-Blackness because of the institutionalization of sexualized concepts. Anti-Blackness is a sexual philosophy. The underpinnings of all mutations of anti-Black violence are intensely sexual philosophies, and somatic
Wow.
myths even when it seems the violence is not sexual. So when we
Wow.
think about false accusations of rape against Black men, when we think about reproductive injustice, when we think about forced hysterectomies like Fannie Lou Hamer endured, when we think about the hypersexualization of Black women, which is used to deflect their victimhood, targeted victimhood as victims of sexual violence by white men from slavery until now. All of that is being missed because we need our leadership packaged in a certain aesthetic.
Yep.
And that aesthetic is not freeing us. There's no substance to it, there's no nuance to it, there's no
Yep.
intersectionality to it. And so for me, I think we really have to challenge ourselves to get beyond the aesthetic of
Yep.
who should be taken seriously based on how they look and who we are ignoring based on how they're not presenting.
Yeah, that was just so brilliant. Thank you both. And I love this question about respectability, and what we lose when we're welded to respectability. It's funny because what's been coming up for me, which I did not fully form this thought as I started, y'all. So I hope we can go on this journey together. But what do we think about is recently I went to the Superfine exhibit, which the Met Gala last year was Black Dandyism. Is that right? And then now that at the Met, they have the Superfine exhibit, which I really, really recommend it if it's still there to go look, because a lot of it is about queerness and politics of respectability through dress. And something that's really interesting in that exhibit is they talk about how many Black women who were white passing escaped slavery by dressing as men in travel. And that they kind of use like cross-dressing as a way to access power and respectability. And what I think about respectability when I think about queerness is how queer people almost they demonstrate how it's easy to reach respectability by performing it. Like we see it in our own performances. This calling out of respectability and norms, and saying like it's easy to be in this body and perform the norms you're asking me to. And I am actively saying I want to be in my queerness. I am actively saying I don't want to be a culture fit. I want to challenge the community, like, or I want to challenge preconceived norms of who belongs by being in my body, by claiming my queerness, by being who I am. And so I think actually through queer people, we're reminded that respectability is a performance, that it is a way to reach into and parody and reach for white supremacy to the detriment of our own selves as a Black community. And I think I made me think about that, Harrison, as you talked about dance and performances, and how do queer people remind us that we can perform these systems if we want to, and we're saying actually we want to be in who we are in our authentic selves. And so I think about who do we lose when we want to maintain performance and respectability, but also how do we also become complicit in our own dehumanization by staying within politics of respectability? For example, we think about some cis heterosexual Black women who uphold patriarchal norms within the Black church and beyond. What is lost of your own feminine power? What is lost in your own stepping into your own self by propagating these norms? And so I think we also have to ask ourselves if we're welded to respectability because we think it's the most legible to white supremacy. That if we are a Black community led by Black men, that is more legible than we're a Black community led by a kaleidoscope of people who look different and who look, I don't know, who just have different bodies and different people. So in your question, I thought about how do queer people help us challenge respectability by looking at queer performance, but also how do we consider that respectability can sometimes be us being welded into white supremacy as a way to get a crumb at the table of liberation, but we want a meal. So how do we get that? Like if we think about Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks, it was all about whose body will we care about more being dehumanized, but we need to draw that circle wider. Something Pauli Murray whenever my brothers draw a circle to exclude me, I draw a wider circle to include them. And I loved that quote. And I think that really is the work of civil rights. And I think that's the work that queer people have done, is to extend a lot of generosity to cis heterosexual Black folks who have drawn a circle to exclude them. And the last thing I'll say is a similar quote comes from Father Gregory Boyle in his really great book, Tattoos on the Heart, which is a religious text. And he says, our job is to draw the circle of compassion of God so large that no one stands outside of it. And those two quotes are kind of my guiding light when I think about what we lose respectability and what the true work of liberation is. I like what Harrison said, we don't even have to like each other. I don't have to like you, but I want you to be able to live authentically and freely. And that is my guiding value.
Oh, that's so good. That's so good. And you all are making me think about the role of aesthetics and performance in memory. how the aesthetic that one embodies informs whether or not they are remembered.
Mm.
How they dress, how they present, how they talk, if they have a little sugar in their tank, if they walk light in the shoes, right? Like all of these sort of phraseologies of deciding and determining who gets remembered, where some folks are fine with queer folk or trans folk if they present a certain way, as long as you don't offend my sensibilities, right?
Mhm.
And so I want to pause here and sort of invite everyone who's on the Zoom with us to help us continue this work. This work is only made possible because of contributions from folks like you, whether that is $1 or $2 or $5 or $10. We want to invite you to give to this work. If you were moved by anything that a panelist said, if you had an aha moment or an epiphany, I think that is a wonderful opportunity for you to say, I want to be able to give back to the organization that made this space possible. And so there are a few ways that you can give. Cash App is available. We also have Zelle using our finance@prideinthepews.com link. And then we also have Give Butter, which is available as well. So just wanting to flag that and say we invite your contributions, no matter how small or how large, because it helps us to continue to make spaces like this. We are coming up toward the end of our time together, but before we close out, I want to ask one more question before we get to the panelist questions. So the last question that I would like to leave with you is one that's rooted in this political moment. We are seeing ICE kidnap children. We are seeing Black, queer, and trans folk being murdered. We are seeing a robust and extravagant expansion of white Christian supremacy, which deems anyone who is not white or straight or cis as the enemy. And so I'd want to ask each of you, before I invite my colleague in to pose audience questions, this question. What's one lie about solidarity we've inherited that needs to be unlearned for coalition to happen now? What's one lie about solidarity we've inherited that needs to be unlearned for real coalition building to happen now? I'll invite Araya in to answer this one. This is heavy. This is good. And so I'm really curious to see what you all come up with. Araya, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I mean, to echo what Harrison said earlier, movement building is relationship building. It is not just this intellectual thing where we're discussing theory. When you're on the ground, you're dealing with real people, real trauma histories, real lived experiences, and things are clashing. Socialization is clashing. And so when we think about solidarity, we often romanticize it and idolize it and think that it's going to be this smooth process with no bumps along the road. That's not realistic. We have to ground ourselves in reality that there are going to be misunderstandings. There are going to be instances of harm. There are going to be triggers that have to be accounted for. And so figuring out ways to get past our discomfort with conflict, to learn how to repair and zoom out and see the bigger picture and keep going, like these are relational skills that have to be infused into movement building. It can't just be, you can, and I know I just quoted someone, so I'm kind of like contradicting myself, but you can't just quote scholars, you have to be able to deal with people and deal
Mm.
with the things that people deal with. And I think for me personally, like being a therapist has really helped me understand that I don't know people. I don't walk into situations assuming that I know anything about anyone anymore. It has been the most humbling experience of my life.
Mhm.
Every first encounter with a new client, they always share at least 1 to 2 things that I never would have guessed. And so I think we kind of need to bring that to our approach to solidarity, where we're not making these assumptions and carrying in these stereotypes, these preconceived ideas about, well, this person dresses like this, or they talk like this, or they move like this, so this must mean they're for or against me. But you don't really know them. That's such a waste of time, and it's such a waste of energy, in my opinion. And so I think learning how to be less judgmental is one part, and then when we inevitably do make a mistake and judge too fast, learning how to repair so that we can keep going. But yeah, I think that's one myth that we've inherited. I love to see archival stuff of the civil rights movement. But to echo what Harrison said again, like all of the strife, all of the conflict, all of the tension, the lack of consensus that people had to move through, people leaving, people coming, people going, none of that is in the archive. So we can't fill in the gap and assume that that never happened, because our movements today are showing us that it is inevitable. It is going to happen. So it definitely did then. So we got to prepare for that.
That's good. Harrison, I want to invite you in.
Yeah, I was thinking about when you were taking us back to kind of that getting along. I think if we only show people the times we got along, we don't know that repair is possible. And so that's something I think about when I'm thinking about that as well. But the lie I want us to really just strip apart, really just piece by piece, is that freedom is limited. And I think that we have this idea that there is this freedom, but it's so small that it can only be for a small group of people. And I think that is our biggest barrier to solidarity. So that's the one I would offer.
And Ciara?
Yeah, this is such a good question. I'm sitting here just chewing on it as you both are answering, and there's two. One is that the work is viral. Like, it's not viral work, it's not public work. I love what Araya said about it being work in conflict in the self. And a lot of the work it's individual too. Like, so much of my personal deconstruction work was part of what allows me to do this work. I had to look at the homophobia in myself. I had to look at the anti-blackness in myself. I had to ask how God was taught to me throughout my youth and how that's made me or maybe propagate ideas that are exclusionary or unkind or lack compassion. And so there was a way I had to go into the self to be able to go outward. I had to be compassionate. I had to be loving. I had to deconstruct. I had to go inward. I had to, as Christina Cleveland talks about in God as a Black Woman, she had to like uproot white male God in her. And I think a lot of us have to do that work. We can be in Black churches and be worshiping white male God. Those things are not antithetical to one another or oppositional to one another. And so I think I want us to get out of this idea that the work is viral and that it's sexy. It is often personal and messy, but that's the beauty of it too. And God is a Black Woman, she also calls God, she who loves our hot mess. And I think that's a better framework, work that brings us into our mess, work that is unclean or work that is difficult. Harrison, you called that out so well, that there might be messiness as a part of it. So I want people to know that. And the other last thing I want to sneak in there is that elders are not a lost cause. I think that we are starting to treat our Black elders like they are not a part of the work anymore and they are not a lost cause. When I came out to my 80-year-old grandpa, he received me. When I talk now to my 75-year-old grandmother, she loves me. When I call my uncles and my aunties, they pour into me. They know me fully as a Black queer person and they have loved me as a Black queer person. Bayard Rustin's grandmother received his queerness with openness. We think about queer theory created by E. Patrick Johnson. It came from his Black grandmother and how she said the word queer. He came up with queer. So I want to say the work is not viral, the work is individual, and let's not leave our elders behind, I think.
Jesus, that's good. Mic drop. My God. Wow. Black grandmothers are some of the first theologians that queer and trans folk ever meet.
Mm.
Wow. You all, I want to give a round of applause to our panelists for their brilliance and beauty and divinity. And we do not want to leave this space without lifting up some of the questions that you have posed. So I want to invite my colleague, Reverend Jarikas Collins, to actually share and pose those questions to our panelists tonight. So I'll pass it over to Reverend Collins.
Wow. I mean, if I had 10,000 hands, I could not be clapping loud enough and long enough for this needed conversation. Wow. Thank you, Araya, Ciara, and Harrison, for your witness and your beautiful, beautiful words tonight. My name is Reverend Jericus Collins. I serve as a program manager here with Pride in the Pews. And I just want to uplift a few questions today. First, and I want to start with Ciara. Based on your background as a theologian and the work you do as a public theologian, typically public conversations around slavery and racial terror often focus on sexual violence against Black women and children, but rarely Black men. Could you help us to lean into why that's the case, and why, and the question is, why has that history been under discussed?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And it's interesting because I feel like, at least in my educational experience, outside of my African American studies courses, specifically at Berkeley and Harvard, I have never had anyone else, I've never had anyone mention to me sexual violence and slavery broadly, regardless of gender. And so I think it's still an area that I think broadly we are unearthing. We do talk about it somewhat with Black women. There's a book, At the Dark End of the Street, which is a difficult read, but an important read about sexual violence against Black women throughout history, and I highly recommend it. I think when it does come to Black men and sexual violence and enslavement, there is heavily a focus on the experience of being accused of sexual violence, falsely accused by white women in particular, more so than it is the experience of how Black men were treated, how their bodies were treated under enslavement, particularly around sexual violence. And that isn't my primary area of expertise, so I can't speak to maybe why we don't have as many conversations around that. But I think broadly, we are a society that doesn't talk enough about men experiencing sexual violence and sexual assault. And so I think we see this broadly as a social conversation that is lacking. So it makes sense to me that enslavement and its specificity, we're not having it enough. But I will say, like I said, just broadly across the board, I do not think we have enough conversation about slavery and sexual violence. But I also want to open up for my coworkers. I know, Harrison, you're an archivalist, so you might have more information on this than me, and Araya as well. I want to open that up.
Yeah, no, I don't have a ton of information, on that. That is something that comes up quite often, I think, in thinking about that. But I always think that it is definitely centered around shame. I just feel like, just to imagine, whether it is through desire or whether it is through coercion or whether it is through violence, I just think the idea of men, being in the act of intimacy, in the act of violence, that is anything like that. I just think there's so much shame around it that is just really, really reduces the conversation to just not being had. And so I would imagine that some of that avoidance is somehow also wrapped up in some of that shame.
Yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate that. Makes me think, last thing I'll say is, makes me think about Sodom and Gomorrah and how we just say homosexuality is bad versus saying actually men were experiencing sexual violence from other men in this moment. And let's not demonize what's happening there. Instead, let's unpack how these men are being harmed instead of naming that as homosexuality or naming that as queerness. So I think you're right. In general, we struggle to talk about violence perpetrated from men against men and just broadly. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I would just quickly add, bell hooks, for anyone interested, help conceptualize dominator culture. And I feel like we conflate dominator culture with patriarchy. And so dominator culture expects men to always be sort of intimidating, to be fierce, to be in control. And so for a lot of Black men who've experienced sexual harassment, sexual violence, it's seen as a failure of masculinity that was allowed to happen. How did you fail to protect yourself from being victimized? But there's no structural analysis of, what happens or where men should go when it does happen, and there's no resources, right? There's no legibility around being a victim that does not register in people's mind as white, as woman.
Always, when around this is when I feel like there's not enough information or things like that, I always ask myself the question, what system is at risk if this truth is told? And so I love what you said. I love where you're going with the failure of masculinity, because I think that's some of it too.
Yeah, I often say, and I know I'm not on this panel, but Harrison, you just said something so powerful. I said this today, that when we free the oppressed, we often we should be unemploying the oppressor. So that's that crashing of that system, right? That's good. That's good. Speaking about oppressed and oppressor, that whole piece of like the struggle and how we can examine the harshness that has happened being queer, being a part of the movement. How do you practice self-care as an act of resistance? I think often we I think we become one with our struggle, one with pain, one with lament, that we forget about ways to practice care. So, I mean, maybe one way that you practice self-care as an act of resistance.
I'm a big gardener. I'm a huge gardener. I know that that can mean two things. I mean, literally getting in the garden, but there's other forms of gardening too. But I really recommend like there has been no better place for my well-being than being in my garden, than being with my plants. And I think it's because everything that I was told about God is deconstructed in my garden. God is perfectionistic. Well, I come to my garden imperfectly every day and it still thrives. So is God perfectionistic, or I need to thrive on my own? Well, gardens are community based. So do I need to thrive on my own? I think gardens accept every part of me that I was told were not good enough. Every day I can bring them to my garden and they're seen and they're held. So gardening has been my biggest place of well-being.
Yeah,
I
here.
think for me, mine is a little weird and specific, but I spend time with straight Black men in my life. And I do that because I think being around queer people who are a part of what I'm, fighting for doesn't refuel me. I love to do the work. I do it because it's necessary. I am committed, 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 right? But what really truly refuels me is to just be with my friends who are unlikely friends, who get it, who I know that they are allies because of the relationship we've built. That refuels me in a way that really is my self care. And so I know that's a really weird answer to that question, but that is how I really do take care of in refueling, right? And thinking about when I get tired, that energizes me in a way because it reminds me that what I'm working for is possible. That here's the possibility model here, right? So that's how I have a little bit of self care for myself.
I think for me, I'm a big homebody. If you know me, I like to be in my own space, but I love hosting people. And so if you ask me to go out, I'm probably going to say no, but I'm still probably going to invite you over. And so, I think we got to get back to doing things with people that don't require going out and spending money, just in a comfortable environment that feels like very familiar and at ease. And that's how we build community, just breaking bread, relaxing, listening to music, doing things that are very home based sometimes. It doesn't mean that you don't have fun going outside sometimes, but, you know, bringing it in a safe space where people feel comfortable to be fully vulnerable and open and transparent about who they are.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Thank y'all for that. The last question I'll pose is, do you have any examples of cross community activist work? And I can reframe that, cross community queer movement work rather.
I have a very local example that I definitely want to name. So we have a Black gay man who's an icon in Houston to me because he founded our Pride Parade, and he's a Black man who for over 40 years ago founded the parade. And when we figured it out, I just have to tell his story all the time because he was erased for over 4 decades, which is insane. But what he also did at that time was in Houston, he noticed that there was a lack of Latin queer representation in the political space because we have an LGBTQ caucus that at the time was very white, of course. And he founded, a Black man founded the Chicano political caucus in Houston. And he did that so that that community could be bridged to politics and be bridged to rooms where people were speaking about them and for them that they were missing from. And he saw himself as really that vessel, right, to do that work, although he is not of that community, and oftentimes there was a language barrier that he had to kind of work through. But his commitment was, I see people missing from this room, and I think by my relationship with them, the trust that I've built with them, they will be in these political rooms. So I think it's a very local answer. So it's not like viral, as Sierra said, or it wouldn't be a viral thing, but it's a story that I really do love because that allyship, right, and looking beyond your own identity is really important. But it's a true lived example of someone that did that right in the thick of movement work here in Houston.
I love that. And that's so amazing, Harrison. Thank you for lifting that up. It's so cool you all are from the same spot too. I'm sure there's just so much amazing organizing work in Houston. And the Bay is similar. There's so much local work. And I love that you gave a local answer, Harrison, because the answer is in y'all's communities outside your door. Truly, they are there. I go here to the Oakland LGBTQ Center. It is incredible. The programs that they actually just had Princess Hemphill from the Embodiment Institute, an amazing session. So I would definitely say like it's right outside your door. It's in your own communities. My local church in the Bay Area is a queer affirming church. Their name is Oak Life. And we're having, right now, we're about to have a Black Queer Sacred Lounge that we're doing with that I'm doing with some Black queer theologians from across the country that are going to come. And we're going to hold a space to reflect on Black religion, to deconstruct together, to think about Black queer spirituality. So I really agree with Harrison. Like it's in your local communities. You would be surprised. I go on the Eventbrite in my community every weekend, and I'm shocked at the amazing offerings. There was a Black Girl Rest event here in Oakland, and it was a house that turned into an art installation for Black women to walk through and like rest. Like there were mattresses and art everywhere, and it was all about like sleep trauma for Black women and how we can change and how we can be healthier. So I think it's right outside your door. But for me, the biggest example is my church community. They do amazing organizing, and something I want to say is like, oftentimes I'm not sometimes I'm leading these, but I'm coming just as a member. I'm coming to learn. And maybe one other lie I should say about activism is that we're at the front of it. Like so many times I'm coming there to learn and to be in the crowd with others, not to speak or to teach.
Yeah, I mean, one organization that I would recommend, this is sort of like cross solidarity in terms of like issues rather than like identity groups. But Black and Pink is a prison abolitionist organization dedicated toward supporting queer folks, Q plus folks impacted by the criminal punishment system, as well as folks living with HIV/AIDS who are impacted by the criminal punishment system. And so, that's another example of intersectionality. Again, not identity wise, but, cishet Black men take up a lot of space when it comes to discussions about police brutality and prisons, policing, but it's happening to Black women, it's happening to Black queer people, Black trans people. And it's common knowledge that we collectively, as a demographic, are structurally vulnerable. And so it only makes sense that we are impacted in proportion to our marginalization. And so Black and Pink is one recommendation that I have just in terms of cross movement building.
Yeah, that's very robust and gives folks ways to really engage in different creative ways, all of which are ways that we need to be engaged. I do want to ask one more quick question. I know I said I was going to ask that last one was the last one. Um, if there was one Black queer scholar, activist, artist whose work you would design an entire course around, who would it be and why? And I want to name that. I see Dr. Daniel Black, who I know Dr. Black, love his work. E. Patrick Johnson, Dr. Pamela Lightsey. But I also want to invite Araya in. Who would that person be for you?
So there is a Black lesbian writer from Philly named Becky Bertha. And so last year I read her short story collection, which was amazing in terms of like being instructive for me as a writer and someone interested in pivoting toward fiction eventually. And yeah, I was just shocked to learn about her so late in my life. But the writing was just like impeccable. It reminded me of a mix between Toni Cade Bambara and Toni Morrison. And so, yeah, Becky and then Bertha, Bertha. But I think I would focus on her just because she is under discussed and someone who just needs a little bit more attention and preservation in terms of our cultural archive.
Yeah, thank you for uplifting those names. Well, I am so sorry that we have to leave, but we must. Thank you to our panelists for sharing with us. And as we close, I want to invite you to stay connected to this conversation, knowing that this is just a moment in time, but we have more conversations and more work to do together. And you continue that conversation by doing the work every day, by showing up every day, by loving on folk every day, by loving on yourself every day, one day at a time, one foot in front of the other. And so while we close, I want to invite you and encourage you to connect with us on all social platforms, connect with the work, get connected through our newsletter. We want to stay connected with you and inform you of the work that we're doing in ways that you can stay engaged. Thank you so much for being a part of this moment, for listening closely and helping us return again and again to the stories that still have so much to teach us. And we hope you have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Take care.